I guess I should kick this off with how I ended up volunteering at Brookpine Senior Center in the first place. My full-time gig is occupational therapy, helping people recover motor skills, relearn daily tasks, that sort of thing. It's not glamorous, but I've always been drawn to taking care of folks who can't fend for themselves. It's like, I don't know, maybe I've got a savior complex or something. But whatever the reason, I got roped into some volunteer shifts at this facility on the outskirts of my hometown. Now, Brook Pines was a little out of my usual territory. Usually, I work in hospitals or do home visits, but a friend told me they needed extra hands, so I figured why not. I still remember my first day. The building felt more like a cheap motel than a care center. Long beige corridors, flickering fluorescent lights, that tang of disinfectant that never quite leaves your nostrils. The staff looked a little stretched, thin, but hey, that's the state of healthcare these days. I thought nothing of it. I was assigned to the third floor, where some of the more challenging residents lived. Many had dementia or needed hands-on nursing. I spent the day helping them with little tasks. You know, brushing their hair, reminding them how to maneuver a spoon if their hands were shaky. Mostly, I was just a friendly face. Then I met Ms. Greeley. She was in room 317, tucked away in the corner of the hall, one of those tiny single rooms that felt more like a prison cell. She was thin as a rake, pale, with hair that probably used to be a shade of red but had gone smoky gray. She was gripping her walker like someone might yank it away from her. The second I walked in, she looked at me with eyes that said, "Help, me," and holy hell, it rattled me. She started ranting about the tests and how they come at night. I took it for confusion, maybe a medication side effect. But she was so insistent, I swear I could feel my heart rate pick up. She kept telling me not to trust the men in white coats. The weird thing was, the staff at Brook Pines didn't actually wear white coats. It's mostly scrubs, at least on my floor. I shrugged it off, told her I'd check on her later. But her grip on my wrist was like a vice. She whispered, "They're lying to you. I can prove it." Then her eyes flicked to the door, like she was terrified someone would hear. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't let go until I promised I'd come back alone. I wasn't spooked, not yet, but there was a buzz in my brain that kept me from shrugging it off. It was the way she spoke, the way she gritted her teeth every time a nurse walked by. I told myself to keep an open mind. After all, older folks sometimes have these paranoid episodes, especially with conditions like dementia. But that entire first day, my mind kept drifting back to her warning. Maybe if I'd just said, "No, I can't help," I could have saved myself a lot of nightmares. But that's not me. I had to open the damn door and see what was behind it. The second time I checked on Ms. Greeley, it was already getting late. Most volunteers clock out around 5 p.m., but I stuck around to finish up some paperwork. The hall was unusually quiet. Lots of the residents had turned in early, and visiting hours were over. My shoes squeaked on the linoleum. A nurse named Dorothy approached me at the front desk, gave me a sideways look, and asked why I was still there. Honestly, Dorothy's question felt more like a warning. The way she said it, like, "What are you doing?" instead of, "Is everything okay?" sent a trickle of caution through my head. But I made up some excuse about charting therapy, progress, and kept going. When I reached Ms. Greeley's door, she was sitting up in bed, arms folded. She seemed more lucid this time. Her eyes were sharper, her speech more coherent. She gestured for me to shut the door. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed in that uncomfortable, tinnitus-like way, but I tried not to get distracted. "So, what do you want to show me?" I asked. I kept my voice light, but inside I was bracing myself for some weird nonsense, like a horde of plastic spoons or random family photos. That's typical in older folks' rooms, you know? Instead, she pulls open her nightstand drawer. Inside were folded notes covered in shaky handwriting, along with these weird codes, sequences of letters, patient initials maybe. She said, "Read it," but I could barely make sense of half of it. There were references to basement labs, secret watchers, and repeated mentions of room B13. I had no damn clue what B13 meant, because our building's floors are numbered 1, 2, and 3, and the basement is just one big laundry zone. Or so I thought. As I leafed through the pages, Ms. Greeley whispered that she'd been hearing screams late at night, always around 2 a.m., and that the staff were dragging certain patients out of bed. She insisted they'd come back the next morning heavily sedated, sometimes with bruises or bandages they hadn't had the day before. I tried to ask rational questions. Maybe they fell? Maybe it's therapy you're not aware of? This facility is big. She just shook her head. Like I was the dumbest woman alive. She told me to look at Mr. Rourke, a gentleman down the hall who used to chat with her every morning. Recently, he'd gone missing for 3 days, and then reappeared, barely able to lift his head. When she asked the nurses, they said, "Oh, he was transferred temporarily to a different floor for specialized care." She didn't buy it, and honestly, hearing it laid out like that, I wasn't sure if I did either. I tucked the notes back into the drawer. My gut was telling me something was definitely out of place. Still, I gave Ms. Greeley a pat on the hand, told her I'd look into it. She grabbed me by the wrist again, that same iron clamp grip, and said, "They'll try to scare you off. Don't let them. We need you." It's funny, up until that moment, I never saw myself as the hero type. I'm the kind of person who double-checks my door is locked and avoids shady alleys. But something about that old woman's desperation lit a spark under me. I told her I'd be back soon, then I left the room feeling like the hallway was watching me. Over the next couple of days, I went about my usual routine, leading small group exercises, helping folks practice handwriting, just the normal therapy stuff. But I couldn't let go of what Ms. Greeley had said. I started paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way certain staff members kept their voices low when I walked by, how some residents had new bandages or suspicious bruises with half-assed explanations. I remember one conversation with Mr. Rourke. He was back in his room by then. The poor guy looked like he'd aged 10 more years overnight. I asked him casually how he was feeling, and he muttered something about being under observation. Then he went glassy-eyed, like he knew he'd said too much and was terrified. I might repeat it. He wouldn't look me in the eye after that. There was a nurse I actually liked, a younger woman named Tasha. She was sweet, always had a bright smile for the residents. So I tried to bring up my suspicions with her, indirectly. I asked about some weird bruises I'd seen on a patient's arm, tried to frame it like, "Oh, are we using the wrong lift technique?" Tasha's face instantly went pale. She stammered out something about patient privacy and hurried off. That was a big red flag. On the third night, I decided to stay late again and do a little snooping. I know, it was probably stupid, but I needed answers. I ducked into the staff lounge around 8 p.m., quietly rummaging through a filing cabinet that no one seemed to touch. Not the most ethical thing I've ever done, but it felt justified at the time. I found a binder labeled Night Procedures. That alone was odd. Standard procedure manuals don't usually get filed away in an unmarked cabinet. Inside, there were scheduling grids for something called Special Wing B. And there it was. Room B13. My stomach did a slow churn when I saw Ms. Greeley's exact scrawl from her notes matched what was typed in that binder. All the while, I was hyper-aware of every noise in the corridor. My hands were shaking so bad the papers nearly slipped from my grip. I can't lie. It felt like I was stepping onto thin ice, waiting for that first crack. Then I heard voices approaching the lounge. I barely managed to stuff everything back in the drawer and bolt out the side door. I didn't get actual proof that night, but I sure as hell had my confirmation that Ms. Greeley wasn't hallucinating the entire thing. The next day, I rolled in earlier than usual. I'd had maybe 4 hours of sleep, so I was running on coffee and paranoia. I headed straight to Ms. Greeley's room, ready to tell her we needed a new plan. but when I walked in, she was gone. Her bed was perfectly made, like no one had slept in it. For a moment, I just stood there, numb. Then, as if on cue, Dorothy appeared behind me. She barely let me open my mouth before she said Ms. Greeley was moved off-site for specialized treatment. I asked which facility. She shrugged, gave me a condescending half-smile, and said it was above my pay grade. I could feel a prickle of anger flare up in my chest. "You can't just move a patient without informing staff," I said. But Dorothy gave me that blank nurse face, polite but dismissive. She added that Ms. Greeley's medical records were now classified, and I should mind my own assignments. Left the room fuming. I knew that if Ms. Greeley was right, they'd taken her for those nighttime tests, or worse. Part of me wanted to march into the director's office, cause a scene, and demand answers. But I had zero illusions about what would happen if I tried that. Brook Pines was big on hush-hush. I'd probably get fired or barred from the building. Instead, I decided to keep calm and gather intel. If Ms. Greeley had stashed away notes, maybe someone else had done the same. Maybe there was a staff member who'd seen too much and kept quiet. So I spent the day eavesdropping. Not subtle, but I tried my best. I overheard a snippet of conversation between Tasha and an older nurse. They were whispering about how he didn't make it, and when we sedated him, everything went to shit. I had no clue who he was, but I sure as hell knew it wasn't a normal day-to-day discussion. Then I checked on Mr. Rourke again, only to find his room empty too. Specialized treatment, apparently. By that point, I was sick to my stomach with worry. I was losing my patience, literally. They kept vanishing, replaced by vague excuses and locked doors. I'd never felt so powerless. But I damn well wasn't going to back down. That night, I snuck back into the building after hours. Don't ask how. I basically convinced Tasha to leave a side entrance open for me. I think deep down, she wanted someone to blow this place wide open, but she was too scared to take it on herself. I crept through the corridors with my phone flashlight, shoes squeaking on the tile. I half expected a security guard to pop out, but apparently Brook Pines was understaffed in that department, or they were too cocky to think a volunteer would break in. What I needed to find was some proof. Real proof I could shove under the sigh, nose of the authorities. I made my way to the elevator bank, but the elevator only had buttons for floors 1, 2, and 3. No mention of a basement. That's when Tasha's tip came in. The basement was accessible from a locked stairwell near the laundry room. The laundry room was dank and stank of bleach. I tiptoed past industrial washing machines until I saw a steel door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only." Bingo. The lock was a high-tech keypad, which deflated me for a second. But then I remembered Tasha mentioning a default code used for staff emergencies. I typed it in, expecting it not to work. But it beeped and clicked open. I swear my heart was pounding so hard I was sure someone would hear it. Beyond that door was a set of concrete steps leading down. Cold air rushed up at me, carrying this metallic odor, like old pennies or rust. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a dim corridor with metal doors on each side. Everything about it felt wrong. The usual hospital smell of disinfectant was replaced by something heavier, closer to rotting flesh, to be honest. I crept forward, reading the door plaques, B1, B2, B3. The corridor turned a corner, and I saw more doors. That's when I spotted B13. It was the last one on the right, near a flickering overhead light. My hand shook when I reached for the handle. This door had a different kind of lock, like a heavy-duty sliding mechanism. I tugged. It was sealed tight. I pressed my ear to the metal, half expecting to hear screams or moans. And that's when I heard a faint whimper. It sent a jolt through my spine so sudden I almost dropped my phone. Someone was inside. I tried the handle again, but it wouldn't budge. The whimpering paused, then started again, weaker, as if the person had little strength left. "Shit," I whispered. I scanned the corridor, found a supply closet, rummaged through for anything that could jimmy the lock. I settled on a heavy-duty wrench. Desperate times, right? Just as I knelt at the door, I heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. Whoever it was, they moved with a calm, almost leisurely stride, as if they owned the place. I killed my flashlight and pressed my back against the wall, praying they wouldn't see me. My pulse hammered so loud I thought I'd pass out. The footsteps approached, paused near B13, then continued. I caught a glimpse of Dorothy's silhouette, her white uniform almost glowing in the gloom. She hummed to herself like she was taking a casual stroll. I waited until she was out of earshot. That's when I made a snap decision. I had to get inside B13, or I'd never forgive myself. I wrestled with the door for what felt like forever, trying every trick to get it open. Finally, something clicked, and the latch gave way. The smell that hit me made my eyes water, like antiseptic layered over decay. I slid inside and found a single gurney in the center of the room. A figure lay strapped down. An old man. His arms were pinned, and his head lolled to one side. He was mumbling incoherently, his lips crusted with dried blood. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized him. It was Mr. Rourke. I rushed to his side. "Mr. Rourke, it's Serena. Can you hear me?" He blinked, then focused on me with a flicker of recognition. He tried to speak, but it came out a croak. There were dark bruises on his wrists, long needle marks on his forearms, and a faint incision at his temple covered by a bandage that looked fresh. The overhead fluorescent flickered, giving the whole scene a nightmarish strobe effect. My first instinct was to free him, undo the straps, get him the hell out. But just as I fumbled with one of the buckles, he let out a groan that turned into a strangled cough. A small spatter of blood dribbled from his mouth. I couldn't help but mutter, "Oh God," under my breath. This was beyond messed up. Well, I tried to loosen the strap around his torso. I noticed a tray of medical tools on a steel table. Needles, scalpels, vials of who knows what. It looked more like a back alley torture setup than legitimate medical equipment. My blood went hot with rage. Whoever was doing this was going to pay. That's when I heard footsteps again. This time they were coming fast, echoing off the bare concrete walls. Mr. Rourke's eyes went wide in terror. He let out a raspy plea. "Hide. Hurry." I ducked, behind a tall metal cabinet near the corner, heart thudding like a jackhammer. The door slid open, and Dorothy strode in with 2 other staff members, ones I'd seen around but never really spoken to. They didn't notice me at first, too focused on Mr. Rourke. They started hooking him up to some IV, ignoring his weak protests. Then Dorothy said, "We'll try another sedative. He's not responding to the last round." Her tone was cold, clinical. I had never seen this side of her. A chill swept through me as she flicked a syringe, tapped out the air bubbles, and sank the needle into Mr. Rourke's arm without hesitation. He groaned, eyes rolling back. I could see his chest rise in quick, shallow breaths. I wanted to jump, out, to scream at them, but my body was frozen in place. If I attacked them then and there, they'd probably strap me to the next gurney. I couldn't fight 3 people alone, so I stayed hidden, rage boiling. I watched them finish their vile work, scribble some notes on a clipboard, then walk out of the room. The moment they were gone, I scrambled over to Mr. Rourke. But by then, he was unconscious, his pulse fluttery and weak. I had to do something. Call 911, call an ambulance, anything. But the building was locked down, and I was in the basement with no cell signal. My phone read no service. Great. I promised Mr. Rourke I'd be back, patted his shoulder, then slid back into the corridor, determined to find a landline. or at least a security phone. That's when I remembered Ms. Greeley. If this was what they did to him, what the hell had they done with her? I ended up in a frenzied maze of underground hallways. Most of the doors were locked, but a few were open, revealing small labs, storage rooms, and the occasional bed with machines hooked up. The staff was apparently short-handed down here, or they just weren't expecting intruders. In one room, I found Ms. Greeley's walker, tipped on its side, looking abandoned. My pulse hammered like a drum. That meant she was nearby, or had been recently. I kept calling her name in a hoarse whisper, praying she'd answer. My imagination conjured the worst possibilities, her strapped to a table, her body carved up. I tried to force those thoughts away because they'd just send me spiraling. I came across a door labeled B18. This one was slightly ajar, a soft beep, beep, beep sounding inside. I peeked in. It was a smaller medical suite with monitors along the wall. And there, on a gurney, was Ms. Greeley. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving. A clear tube snaked down her throat. Dark bruises mottled her skin. Thick, ugly ones. I hustled over, pulled the tube out carefully. She gagged and coughed, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. I almost cried myself, seeing her so broken. I muttered apologies I'm not even sure she heard. Eventually, she managed a rasp. I told you. Told you they were lying. She tried to give me a smile, but it was more like a grimace. The machines beeped in protest. I unhooked what I could, without setting off alarms. She winced when I peeled away tape-securing IV lines. Every yank felt like tearing my own skin. Then, an alarm started blaring from somewhere else in the basement. Guess they knew I was here, or they noticed Ms. Greeley was being unplugged. Adrenaline slammed into my system. "We need to move," I told her. She nodded, and I helped her into a wheelchair I found against the wall. We navigated the corridor, the alarm echoing like a death knell. Each hallway felt longer than the last. My only goal was to get her out, get Mr. Rourke out if possible, and blow the whistle on this entire twisted operation. We made it halfway down one corridor when Dorothy appeared at the far end, followed by two massive orderlies. She locked eyes with me, and for a split second, I swear there was pity. Then she barked for them to grab me. I pivoted, pushing Ms. Greeley's wheelchair so hard it nearly toppled. "Hang on!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The wheels squeaked, echoing in the claustrophobic tunnel. Doors whizzed past in a blur. My mind was racing. Where the hell was the exit? I had no clue how big this basement was. It felt like an endless labyrinth. Behind us, I heard footsteps pounding. One of the orderlies shouted, "Stop!" The hallway forked ahead. I yanked the wheelchair to the left. That's when I nearly slammed straight into Tasha. She gasped, saw me, saw Ms. Greeley's condition, and her eyes filled with horror. Without a word, she gestured for us to follow her. Tasha led us through a side corridor to a small elevator marked Maintenance. Only, she punched in a code, the doors rattled open, and we crammed inside. She pressed the button for the ground floor, then stared at me with trembling lips. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I gave a curt nod, trying to catch my breath. "What the hell are they doing down here?" She closed her eyes. "It's some hush-hush experimental therapy. They're collecting data, forcing these seniors into trials for big pharma or something. I don't know all the details, but it's wrong." Tasha's face twisted with guilt. "I just needed a job. I didn't sign up for this." The doors slid open, revealing the laundry room. My mind was a tangle of fury and relief. We had a chance now. We just had to reach a phone or the exit and call for help before they locked us in. We burst out of the laundry room and into the first-floor corridors. I expected an ambush, but the place was eerily still. Maybe they thought we'd try to sneak out a back door. Tasha hurried us toward the main exit, But as we passed the reception desk, a heavy-set security guard stood in our way. He had a baton in hand, a posture that said he meant business. Tasha shouted, "We have an emergency. Stand aside." He hesitated, eyes flicking to Ms. Greeley, who looked half dead in the wheelchair. But then, Dorothy showed up behind him, rage etched on her face. "You're breaking the law," Dorothy snapped, stepping closer. "You have no idea how valuable this research is. We're helping society. These are worthless old people who—" That set me off. I cut her off with a string of curses I'd never say in front of my patients. My voice broke as I told her how fucking disgusting she was. Her eyes widened, like no one had ever dared talk to her like that. She lifted a hand, maybe to strike me, maybe to signal the guard. I don't know. But something in me snapped. I tackled her. The baton came swinging, but Tasha ducked and wrestled it away from the guard, surprising everyone, including me, Ms. Greeley let out a pained shout. The confrontation had startled her, and she was gripping the wheelchair arms like she might faint. That woke me up, reminded me we didn't have time for a full-blown brawl. So I jumped to my feet, elbowed Dorothy aside, and we bolted for the sliding glass doors. They flew open to the night air. We stumbled out, Tasha nearly losing her grip on the wheelchair as we crossed the parking lot. I fumbled for my phone. Still, no signal. But at least we were out. We just needed to find a place to call 911. There was a gas station a block away. We hustled, ignoring the stares of a random passerby. Maybe I looked like a deranged kidnapper pushing an old woman in a wheelchair, but I couldn't have cared less. At the gas station, I told Tasha to watch Ms. Greeley while I used the payphone. I dialed 911, gave them everything in a rush. Location, situation, how patients were being tortured. The dispatcher sounded baffled, maybe uncertain if this was a prank call. But eventually, they said officers were on their way. By the time cops and ambulances showed up at Brook Pines, we were there waiting, refusing to set foot back inside without backup. The staff tried to spin some bullshit story about these people are confused. It's a break-in. But Ms. Greeley was taken to a hospital, got scanned, photographed. The evidence was right there on her body. And Tasha eventually confessed, on record about the secret basement, the experiments, the hush-hush protocols. She had emails, schedules, documentation, enough to bury the sick bastards who started it. As for Mr. Rourke, they found him in B13, sedated but alive. A couple more seniors were scattered in those hidden rooms, too. Some were in rough shape, probably won't fully recover from what they endured. But at least they were rescued before it got any worse. I testified in court a few months later. Dorothy and several high-ranking staff members were arrested. Turns out the center was funded by shady pharmaceutical grants to conduct illegal clinical trials on patients who couldn't consent. The stench of it was too strong to cover up once the cops dug in. I'd love to say justice was neat and clean, but it rarely is. The owners lawyered up, bailed out. Some low-level scapegoats took heavier charges while the big fish wriggled away with fines. Still, Brook Pines got shut down. Some residents were transferred to better facilities, ones that actually gave a damn. And Ms. Greeley, she survived, but the trauma aged her. She's in a safer place now, though still haunted by what happened. I visit her once a month, bring her fresh flowers, chat about anything but that nightmare. She's grateful, but I can't shake the feeling she's still waiting for the other shoe to drop. As for me, well, I kept volunteering in geriatric care. Yeah, it changed me. I'm not as naive. I've seen how far some assholes will go in the name of research. But I'm still here, in scrubs, doing what I do best, helping. And you know what? I'll never regret opening that damn door in the basement, because if I hadn't, more folks would have died down there, alone and terrified. So that's my story. I still see the horror of that place every time I close my eyes. It's the smell, mostly, the stench of old blood and bleach. But whenever I feel that panic rising, I remind myself, I walked out alive, and I dragged a bunch of people with me into the daylight. That's gotta count for something. Sure, I got nightmares. Sure, I got regrets. But I'm here telling this tale. That's more than some of them can say. And if you ever get the chance to help someone in a situation like that, do it. Doesn't matter if your hands shake or your legs feel like rubber, because once you see something that evil, you realize the real horror is letting it go on without a fight. You made it to the end, but are you sure the story's over? Some things have a way of sticking with you, creeping back in when you least expect it. If you want more nightmares, there's another story waiting for you right here. But don't say I didn't warn you. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what would you have done differently? Or maybe the better question is, what would you do if this ever happened to you? Subscribe if you haven't already. Just don't blame me when you start sleeping with the lights on.